This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. My guest today is a dear friend. I would say a dear old friend, but it's pretty obvious that both of us are pretty old. But we've been friends for, well, since 1964 was when we arrived. And when did you come to Athens?
63.
In 63. But of course, actually, you are an alum of Ohio University.
I was here from 47 to 52.
I see. Okay.
And then disappeared into the wilderness and came back.
Right. Well, I know that you're particularly a specialist on the U.S. Supreme Court. And so what we're going to be talking about today are the 4 women justices who have been Supreme Court associate justices. And when did you first have this interest in the Supreme Court?
Well, of course, I taught in the School of Journalism, and I taught communication law, and many of the cases we talk about are Supreme Court cases.
Sure.
Such as the New York Times versus U.S. when the Pentagon Papers were published without permission by the Times, and the Washington Post began publishing them right away too.
That was during the Vietnam War.
Yes, and then when it became time to choose sabbaticals, which a professor has the opportunity every 7 years to go someplace that will enrich his or her teaching and research. So my first one was at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press in Washington, and naturally we always watched every journalism case, communication case of any sort at the Supreme Court. And then the next 2 were at the Supreme Court. In 95, 96, I was there for the entire term. The Supreme Court opens at the first Monday in October every year, and is in session until the end of June. They want to be out of there by July 4th, and many of the most important cases, while they may be heard earlier in the year, they are decided in the flurry of that last few weeks, which we're into now. They're really not arguing cases this week because they're trying to catch up on deciding what they've already had argued.
Right.
And that's rather typical. So then both years I went from those times from September through June to be there for every argument. I think sometimes some of the cases are so boring if you want the truth, and I think I was the only person that heard every argument except for the clerk of courts, and he had to be there. Right. And the justices.
And the justices themselves.
Yes.
Yeah. Because people would drop in and out, and of course it's a public place, and although they're very cautious, I suppose they have heightened security now.
Oh, very much so. It always have, because somebody can get pretty upset about one side or the other of the case being argued. When a case is very, very, very popular, such as the right of homosexual people to marry, or right of birth control, or abortion actually, people will be lined up way the night before, and depending on the weather, they're out there in the snow and the rain and whatever, so that they can be the first in line. And then in the morning, they start admitting people, and the line lasts through the day, of course. A very interesting time when it was when the court was arguing about accommodations for handicapped people, or the right to select one's own time of dying, actually. Oregon had said that you could have assisted suicide. That would be legal. If you were in bad shape and were going to die soon anyway, might as well go ahead and do it rather than live in pain. But New York said no assisted suicide. So the fastest way to get to the Supreme Court is to have two state Supreme Courts disagree like that. And that case advanced very quickly. Well, there were all sorts of people in wheelchairs in attendance. And it was rather humorous, if you could look at it that way, at lunchtime, because they have two cases in the morning and sometimes one case in the afternoon. I've even seen two cases in the afternoon, but usually it's one if they have arguments in the afternoon. So all these people were in the dining room in their wheelchairs. Therefore, they had to stack all the chairs out in the hall because everybody has his own chair. And there are all sorts of cases that attract big crowds. And they have no accommodations for them. You have to stand out in the wind and the snow and the rain and anything else, or the good weather. Sometimes it's good weather too. And but you do have to stand in lines to get in. But I would encourage everybody that is in Washington for any type of business to include the Supreme Court as one of the places you want to see. On an ordinary day, it isn't that crowded. And you just go in, and you do have to check everything at a particular station, and leave even your most valuable things. They have lockers. You can put your camera and your purse and so on in there. You can't take anything in with you. And then you get in line once you've checked your gear, and you are allowed to stay until there's more demand for the space you're sitting in. And some days you can hear a whole case. Other days they move people out in about 10 minutes and just move the crowd around.
I see.
The ushers are very, very clever and very courteous. They really have no trouble with people. You're not allowed to talk. They have no trouble with that. And the opening of the court, though, do try to get there if you visit before 10, because then you get to see the opening of the court, which is very impressive with all these heads in black robes emerging from a black curtain. It has three holes in it where the most important, the Chief Justice, his senior person and next senior person emerge out of the middle, and then the two sides have three more on each. And the curtain just opens kind of automatically, and these people come floating out in their black robe. They just look like 9 heads. And then the bailiff calls the signal for the session to start, and it's very impressive. And hearing a case is impressive, even though sometimes the arguments can get boring naturally, especially if you aren't very schooled in the law. But there's always something interesting happening. Each case gets an hour. Each attorney gets a half hour. The defense and the prosecution.
So if they do 2 in the morning, or it would be like from 10 to 12?
That's right. And Chief Justice Rehnquist, who was the chief both times I was there, I really haven't seen the present Chief Justice in action. But,
Mr. Roberts.
Yeah. And but if everybody remembers a Plastic Man in the comic books, that his arm could extend to about 20 feet. If somebody looked like he was running over time with Chief Justice Rehnquist in the seat, he would just poke his arm out there. I swear it grew considerably, and he'd say, "Your time is up." But of course they have a podium for the lawyer that's presenting his case at the time, and it has a light. He knows when he has 7 minutes left and when he has 3 minutes left, and so on.
So they do warn them.
Oh yeah. It's not a big surprise. But the thing is, people take a lot of care in preparing their cases, of course. It's not uncommon for a young attorney to have to give up the rest of his practice. And so it's really very costly to him or her to argue a case at the Supreme Court. But they prepare as gruelingly as they can. And for some time, I doubt if he's doing it now, but Ralph Nader would gather up a covey of attorneys that would act as justices, get 9 of them together, and they had a headquarters in DuPont Circle, where the young man or woman would argue his case and undergo the questioning from the pretend justices and so on. It gave him a rehearsal, and that was very helpful.
Well, it must be rather difficult, though, for a journalist. I mean, journalists, maybe not, but you often see a journalist with a piece of paper and a pencil, you know, making notes as they are talking to someone.
That's right.
But you say that you weren't even permitted to take pencil and paper in.
Oh, well, the journalists are. They have special seating over along the side. In fact, you're within the same breathing space as the most junior justice, because they're up here in front of the whole audience, and the 2 rows for the journalists are over here on the side. But some cases attract maybe 100 journalists, and they're behind a curtain, but they can hear everything, and they are very good at identifying voices. I learned to do it myself, and I was just there for a term, school term each time. So that's no problem. And
so you went once in about 95, and then again for another sabbatical, is
95,
that correct?
96 was the first one, and 204 and 5 was the second.
I see.
And one big change that was so helpful after, for the second one, between the 2, I don't know what year they changed this, but it was in those 7 years between, they began putting the names of the justices on the transcripts. The transcripts, which are available a couple days after the argument, but of course the newspaper or broadcast person has to take his notes or her notes frantically, because you have to put your news item on the air or in the paper before the transcript comes out. So your own scribbling of your handwriting has to be accurate. And but when they at first they just had the attorney's name and what he said, and then it would say bench, and then what one of the justices said, then the attorney's name again, and what he said, and then the bench, and the next he said. And so what I did to help with my research, I put down a key word of what the justice said, so I could identify whoever said that, like banana nana or some strange word like that. I would put that down, and then when I saw that on the transcript, I knew it was he.
Which one? Yeah, yes. Because there are 9 justices.
Oh yes, and but even I learned the voices very nicely. One time, when all of the prominent journalism people were there, I was thrown out of the primary journalist space, and I used to sit with the court artists, and that's a really good space because they have to see they're drawing those same images that they drew dozens of times before and so on. But anyway, I got along pretty well. But when I returned in 2004, they had started putting names of the justices on the transcript, which was a big help.
And of course now there's a brand new justice, Mr. Gorsuch, the first new one in 7 years, I guess. The most recent one before him was Elena Kagan.
Yes.
Well, we should identify these women, these 4 women that you're going to talk about. And we see a picture here. This is actually a huge portrait, which is one of the main features of the National Portrait Gallery. And the artist who did it didn't actually have the people, the women standing in front of him or sitting in front of him. He did them individually, and then he, put them in a setting which is within the court, apparently. But, I mean, for instance, the lady with the white hair is Sandra Day O'Connor, and she had white hair, I think, from the beginning, because she was one of those women who turned white very early in life. But she was on the court for quite some years.
Well, she was on from 81 to 2006, and she was blonde before. And her husband of many years was getting into Alzheimer's problems toward the end of her career, and she first had a sitter for him at home, and then she would actually bring him to the court. Their offices are very big, and they can have somebody sitting there and not bothering them very much. But she had attendance to him, and she would bring him with her. And then finally, she decided just to resign and take him in his last days of mental problems with. And take care of him at home, and he died about 2 months later, and that was so bad that she had resigned, but because she wanted to stay on, but out of loyalty to him, she resigned, and that's how this opening happened. So I had seen both of them, O'Connor and
the times that you were there, she was on the court, actually.
Yeah, the first time I was there.
Well, I would mention that, you know how it is with ships that pass in the night, people who do things although they never meet. She was at Stanford at the time that I was a student there.
Oh, I see.
She was finishing up. I think she was, she was in the class of 1950, and I went in 48. And then, after she graduated, had her undergraduate degree, she went to Stanford Law School.
That's right.
So she was there after I actually left, because I left in 51. I finished up in 51. But she has an interesting background that I, related to, because I grew up in the West, and she grew up in the West. She was born in El Paso, and she, her parents had a big ranch, way out in the sticks.
That's right. She was really a very lonely child, but they were well off. There was no question about that.
Right.
But when it got to the serious part of elementary school and high school, for elementary school, she went and lived with her grandmother.
Yes, in El Paso, in Texas. But she was from Arizona, basically, and she was a ranch girl. She did a lot of riding and that sort of thing before she went away to college.
Well, her appointment to the court is very interesting. As a matter of fact, while she was did you ever date Rehnquist?
No, that's true. Rehnquist was there at the time, yes.
Yeah, he was at Stanford at the time, and they dated a time or two. But when Reagan was running for president, they saw the polling of women going down a little bit for Reagan. And so he asked his campaign manager or somebody that was in the mix, how can we improve this? And this person's idea was appoint a woman to the promise you will appoint a woman to the Supreme Court. And he didn't think about it again. And after he was, but he did mention it in several speeches, evidently. And after he was elected, women reminded him of this, that he had said he would do that. And so he didn't have to look very far, because he not only was at Stanford the same time that O'Connor was, but they had dated a time or two. And so he selected her, and of course it is a very fine law school. And and therefore they were both from Stanford. And he was the chief when she was on the court.
Rehnquist, that is, right.
But one thing that kind of fries me, I just don't know why I'm so prejudiced, but why they don't look past Harvard or Yale all the time. So many more of the justices are from Harvard or Yale. And for instance, Justice Stevens was such a very good asset to the court. He never got emotional, he never fussed, he just did a scholarly job of being a justice. And he had gone to the University of Chicago Law School.
Oh, yeah.
But it is very rare anymore. You just look down the justice list and...
Well, you know, it is interesting, though, that those 4 women did go to different schools. For instance, Ginsburg finished at Columbia. I think she started at Harvard.
She started at Harvard, but she got married and her husband got a job in New York City, so she finished at
Columbia. And she had a couple of children, you know, long before she was on the court.
Well, so did O'Connor have several children.
And O'Connor had children.
But now the younger women justices do not.
Elena Kagan has never married, apparently. She's now another interesting thing about, you know, the backgrounds, you might say, of the justices is that the current court, as I understand it, I mean, this is men and women, obviously, is 6 Catholics and 3 Jews.
That's right.
There are no Protestants, and of course decades and decades.
You had to be a Protestant.
There were nothing but Protestant justices.
Yes, that's right. Well, that just happened. I don't know that it affects people's judgment, and in fact, Breyer says he was born to a Jewish family, but about the end of it. But
not particularly
they're not
observant.
But anyway, we should mention Sotomayor. It was also went to Ivy League schools on scholarships. Now, I love it when somebody that was poor as a child succeeds, because I think a lot of people, such as our present president, they've never had any hardship or anything. I think it gives them an unreal view of what a lot of other people in the country are dealing with.
Born with a silver spoon in their mouth, so to speak.
But Sotomayor had quite a hard childhood. She was born in Brooklyn, and she was the child of a Puerto Rican family. And of course, the Puerto Ricans can come back and forth at will. So her whole community was kind of fluid, and including she and her mother would go to Puerto Rico once in a while. But her father died when she was just 9, and then it was discovered by her, she was very smart, that something was wrong with her. And she's the one that had her mother take her to the doctor, and she had a serious case of juvenile diabetes. She managed that all by herself. Nobody else in the family knew anything about it. She did the reading on it, and she did had handled her own medications and so on. And then they were pretty poor all the time she was growing up, and you know, and so. Then when she got to be college age, she'd done such a wonderful job in high school, it wasn't that big a problem to get a scholarship to Princeton. And then she did so well there, then she got to go to the Yale Law School from there. And it's just an amazing tale, but there are very few of them. Thomas was born in Pinpoint, Georgia, which he identifies as being Savannah, Georgia. And he doesn't confess to having much of a deprived childhood, but I don't think Pinpoint sounds like a very great place. And But otherwise, there's just no one to kind of represent the feelings and the background and maybe what some of the decisions would mean to the poor people as well as the better off.
Yeah, well, Thomas doesn't seem to have learned any lessons from that. Maybe I'm being prejudiced, but he was not the first black on the Supreme Court.
Oh,
the
heavens
first
no,
black,
Thurgood Marshall was outstanding.
Thurgood Marshall was,
Yeah.
I mean, he was the one who actually argued Brown versus Board of
That's
Education
right.
in
And now
1954,
he has
which ended segregation.
Now he has a
Essentially.
building named for him right there by the train station.
Yeah,
It's a big building.
right.
But Thomas is just a different kettle of fish entirely. Well, one thing I wanted to point out about the women justices, because all the cases have not been decided yet, they're getting into really important decisions now. When you hear a really important case argued earlier in the year, it's probably not going to be decided till April or May,
Right,
or even June,
right.
because they're very hard. And then so the more minor cases are decided right away. In fact, I saw one this year they hired without argument.
Oh, really?
They decide without argument, of all things. But anyway, the end of the year is spent on these difficult cases, and of course Gorsuch can't participate much because he just got there, and they're all argued already. So he just maybe.
But he also he can vote.
No, he doesn't vote on a case. He didn't hear the oral argument.
Oh, really?
No.
I thought he was a deciding vote recently.
Well,
Maybe, but you know, it's just something I heard out of the corner of my ear.
Well, usually they don't. If they don't hear the oral argument, they don't participate in the decision. But it could be under some special circumstances.
Yeah, it might have been something that went through real fast, like
but anyway, I looked at the 15 most prominent cases this year, and the three women voted together on every one of them.
That's interesting. On the other hand, they were all appointed by Democrats.
Except Reagan. Well, the ones that are still there, you're right.
The ones that are still there were all appointed by Democrats because Ginsburg was appointed by Clinton, and Obama appointed the last two
yes.
women, Sotomayor and Kagan.
But now on these 15 cases that they all decided together, 13 were on the winning side, and 2 they were on the losing side. Now for the other justices, Breyer voted with them 12 times. That's what made them 4 instead of 3.
4 instead of 3,
and
right.
then Kennedy 9 times. Roberts voted with them 8 times. But now you get into, of course, Scalia missed the last couple months, but he had voted with them 3 times.
I saw something rather interesting while I was doing fast research this morning, in which I can't remember now who it was that spoke up among the justices, but one of the justices said that they thought it had been rather interesting, the fact that because there were only 8, you know, after Scalia died, and then Obama tried to appoint someone and the Republicans absolutely refused. Their constitutional duty to have any hearings or anything. And so they waited until Trump was elected, and you know, now they were able to put Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. But this person said that actually they had to do more sort of talking to each other and so on, a lot more than they did ordinarily.
Really?
When they knew that it was going to be 5-4, or I mean, it could very well be 5-4.
That's
when it was going to have to be 4-4,
Yeah.
maybe they had
they
to
also,
talk about things.
thinking that they would get an appointment even earlier than Gorsuch, they put off some of the more itchy cases to be heard later, but I don't think that's helped much. Well, anyway, I just wanted to say Thomas did join the women twice, and Alito, who came in very late and just voted on the last few, voted with them 3 times. But anyway, on the losing side, Breyer voted with them twice, even when they lost. But anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting. And now, one thing that
what were these cases that the 3 women were on the losing side, but they were all 3 were on the losing side?
Oh, gee, I'm sorry I didn't take enough notes on that, but they're just 2, let me see, what did I say, 3?
I was just wondering if it was something which really affected women in some way.
Oh, it's just 2 as a matter of fact. No, they weren't. But anyway, yeah, just 2 because there are 13 that they were all on the winning side. So we can.
Were there some that you found particularly interesting of some of these cases? This would have been for not this current year,
yes,
of course, but the previous year.
They'll just come out in about by the end of July. They'll come out with this year's cases evaluations, and that'll be on the web. Anybody can look it up there. And I must say I haven't followed them like I used to.
Right, but it was a sort of a constitutional crisis in a sense, because of the fact that there was that practically whole year when there was 8 justices.
Yes, that's right. But it didn't. Not too many came out 4-4. That's when they had to worry about something. But they didn't have that. That would become as big a problem as they thought they would be. There have been about 50 books written about the Supreme Court, and of the ones on the court right now, Sotomayor wrote a very interesting book. My daughter gave it to me for Christmas one time, and it's My Beloved World, and it's certainly worth reading to see about how somebody as poor as she was and as disadvantaged, not only her family but the whole community where she lived, could rise to this level and be so respected. Then O'Connor wrote one, Out of Order, and about the majesty of the law, and then Ginsburg wrote one that's called My Own Words. And now books about them. There's an interesting title, Sisters-in-Law. That's about
Sisters-in-Law.
That's about O'Connor and Ginsburg.
Oh, right.
And then just there's one called I Dissent, which is just about Ginsburg. And then
is she noted for her dissents?
Well, yes, and for writing the dissent. One of the very great problems that developed after Thomas was put on the court is that he just wasn't good at writing opinions, and sometimes, a couple times that I know of, he was assigned the majority opinion, and a person like Breyer would write a corollary morally, supportive opinion to the majority opinion, and it was so much better they used it.
Oh dear.
For the majority opinion. Now, I hate to be so negative about Thomas in general, but he really hasn't added much to the court. But he is good about meeting with groups of high school kids and other tourists and so on that come into the court, and he's willing to take the time to talk with them and help show them around. And
Oh,
so
that's
on.
good.
And then there's one more book I wanted to mention. As Sandra Day O'Connor's book, How the First Woman on the Court became its most influential justice. That's about her, not by her.
I see.
Yeah.
This is someone who was quite impressed with her service.
Well, yeah, two of these books about the court were written by Jo, that's J.O., it's a woman, Biskubic. And I saw a lot of her when I was there because my little headquarters was in the press room. And of course the press secretary of the court is very informed person and gives out all the news about the court. I mean, helps with all the news about the court. But the big media have somebody there nearly all the time. And they cooperate with the press secretary. And so, of course, we know Nina Totenberg from NPR. Nearly everybody knows that name. But there are some others that are for the major newspapers and the press associations. And then another name that probably a lot of people here would know is the man that's on CNN so much now, Jeffrey Toobin. He is at the court a lot because he did write an excellent book about the court called The Nine. And,
now, I know that you had as a very dear friend a person who was really a White House correspondent, Helen Thomas.
Yes, but she never did anything with the court.
On the court.
No. And in our the news service at which I worked in D.C., the Scripps Howard News Service, those two never mixed. We had one reporter that did the court and one reporter that did the White House. And
never the twain should meet.
Well, sometimes, for instance, one man I was very good friends with did the State Department and would substitute at the White House. But usually for those big assignments, they're not usually mixed because the person has worked out his contacts and all
they're
the
really
other,
specialists.
Yeah, just about their one place, and that they might go to the other place someday as a substitute, but it's very difficult to get the lingo and the contacts you need to understand what really happened.
Right, the historic background.
Yeah.
That surrounds all these things. That's for sure.
Yeah. So anyway, there are about 7,000 appeals to the court. They're called writs of certiorari every year. 7,000.
7,000 try to get there.
That's right.
And they only take about, what, 60 or so at most?
Well, they can argue up, I've heard 70 and even 75. I don't know, that sounds like it's over the edge. But that's all they can accept. And then sometimes they change their mind, and once in a while the thing's settled while they're considering whether they're going to hear it. But there was an interesting thing on CNN just this morning about the role of clerks. Only the very most outstanding law students from the most outstanding law schools get to be clerkships at the Supreme Court. And for instance, Gorsuch was a clerk to two justices when he graduated from law school. And he is a Middle Western law school. He went to school in the Midwest. He went to law school in the Midwest and so on. For one thing at a time, we don't have somebody from Harvard or Yale. So that'll be a good sprinkling in, I think, of talent. But anyway, the most prominent person on the argument, each attorney gets a half hour exactly, and of course they have prepared and prepared and prepared. As I mentioned before, they even sometimes have rehearsed with a group that offered to act like the justices, and then the guy gets one sentence out of his mouth when he gets up there, and Ginsburg is the most likely to break in with a question right away. And then Thomas never talks. He's spoken maybe 4 times in the whole time he's been on the Supreme Court. And but he says that's because he's there to listen, not to talk. But I think the questions the justices ask are really quite good. Now this brings up another gripe of mine about Scalia. With everybody making Scalia into some sort of god and all that just because he died by mistake.
Yes, right.
But he was quite a distraction. He would make jokes and so on during the argument, and this poor person that came from his town wherever he worked would and to do this, and has put a year's effort into getting ready for it and so on, and then somebody's making jokes and then taking time for that, and then time for the audience to laugh and so on.
And that comes out of his half hour.
Yeah, that's right, it does. And but the most one of the most interesting cases I heard was the first one I heard. I don't like to say in the South in particular, but there are places where the judicial system is not at the best. And these remote towns in the South especially, I think, may have that problem where the whole town is run by this group that gets in there and has the court and the city council and everything under their jurisprudence. So, anyway, this case was about a man who was an attorney, and he had divorced his wife, who had worked in a beauty shop all the time he was in law school to help earn his way through the law school. And then after several years of practice and hobnobbing with the city biggies in their little town, he decided he had outgrown her and that he was wanted a divorce. Well, here she was with no further training than this little beauty shop that she was operating at home, and so she was kind of defenseless because he had a whole lot more education and he had a lot more experiences and so on. So somehow, this is almost unbelievable, he had got their divorce worded so that her name was taken off the children's birth certificates, and this new wife that he wanted was put on as the children's mother. And she had no visitation rights at all, kaput, and it just had no rights under, because it was a court decision to go along with this plot that he had. So anyway, they argued this case, and there were several good questions, especially from Ginsburg and O'Connor, and so I was very pleased later in the year to see that she won. And, I mean, how can you deprive a mother of ever seeing her own children unless she has a problem herself, such as drugs or drinking or something? And so that built up my optimism about the way that the Supreme Court does have a way of, when something unfair is really happening out in the boonies, and this is the boony of all boonies where I'm talking about now, that it can be straightened up so that it at least meets what is happening elsewhere in the country.
Yes, yes.
And it makes a big difference. So you know, when the Supreme Court was organized, I mean, thought up and gotten together, hardly anybody knew exactly what it was supposed to do. And it had, well, a chief and 5 justices, so already it had an even number. And we're worrying about 8. They just had 6.
It has changed over the years because it's one of the things that was not put in the Constitution. It had to be passed by legislation, how many justices there were, and it's changed over time.
Right.
I think there have been more than 9 at one point.
Well, now Roosevelt wanted more than 9. He
wanted more than
about
9.
19.
That's true.
Because this court was not being very kind to his New Deal program.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing about these lifetime appointments. We're used to 4 years for presidents, 6 years for senators, 2 years for congressmen, although they're talking about increasing that to 4 years. But the Supreme Court depends on the legislature, on the Congress setting the number of justices. Right. But it hasn't been changed in a long time now.
No, Roosevelt's the last one that tried to change it.
They haven't tried it.
He didn't succeed in that.
He really ran against a brick wall on that case. Well, you know, I was reading on the internet this morning about a dissent that was made by Sotomayor. And the person who was writing this up was saying, well, good for her. You know, it was one of these cases. And then there have been a number that have come before the court recently about police power, and the fact that, you know, we're getting a lot of cases where people are saying, well, gee whiz, the policeman shot this guy and he was running away and so forth. Why did they shoot him? And they discovered he was unarmed and all this sort of thing. And there's this outcry about police violence. And Sotomayor really doubled down on that in one of these recent cases, which was decided, you know, in the favor, once again, it was decided in favor of the policemen using the violence.
And then someone brought it to the Supreme Court after that.
Yeah. So they thought they were really praising her for her outspokenness about the problem of police violence.
Well, you asked about the cases this year. One of them involved a 7th or 8th grade girl that, I think she was 15, so it'd have to be a high school girl, and the school suspected her of something, and so they stripped her and searched her. And that was the case she brought to, and that her family brought to the court, that this shouldn't happen to a girl. And it's one of the examples that O'Connor gives in her book. She said that since she was the first woman on the court, all the men said, that happens all the time to boys. They're strip searched if they are suspected of having something on their bodies that they shouldn't have in school and so on. And so she gave them an education of why it's less comfortable for a girl to go through that, and actually her point of view won. And so I don't know. It's unusual. I think it's unusual for schools to have rules that are different for boys and girls. But it could be that this is what happened in this case. But anyway, that was one of the positive things caused by women being available in courts and so on. Now, I think that law schools are another one of the professional schools that now have more women than men in the country.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And medical schools also.
But of course, still the males are more likely to get the jobs and so forth. I mean, it's really interesting to see what happened to people like O'Connor and Ginsburg, who were like, well, I think Ginsburg was first in her class and O'Connor was like third or something like that. But they found it very difficult to get their first jobs as lawyers.
Well, Sotomayor is a really, Kagan is a really extraordinary case in how to get to the Supreme Court. There's a position in the Supreme Court, well, it's a position in the country called Solicitor General. And a lot of people don't even know about it. They know what the Attorney General is, running the entire legal system of the country, but the Solicitor General is the people's representative in court. And so if you can tell that a case is thought of as being really, really important if the Solicitor General is arguing for the U.S. And so she went through several stages in her development, and then she had the opportunity, and of course she was also dean of the Harvard Law School. So that was unusual for a Supreme Court justice to have that as a background. And then she was chosen as the Solicitor General for the country. And
she was that for Obama for a while.
She was that about 2 months. And then she was named to the Supreme Court.
Right. He read her resume, saw that he had named her Solicitor General and kicked her upstairs, so to speak.
Well, they would have had the opportunity. The Solicitor General was involved, well, nearly in every case at the Supreme Court, but that person is involved if it's a very important case to the government. And that's the sharpest knife in the drawer, so to speak.
Well, I think that Thurgood Marshall was also Solicitor General before he was named to the court, and
that's
he was
right.
named by our guy from Texas. Lyndon Johnson.
Johnson. Oh, yes.
I'm talking about
right.
Marshall.
Yeah. And that's yes. Thurgood Marshall was so dignified, and he was a wonderful justice. And because I attended the court for other purposes, and he was still on the court, and you could tell from the way he acted and conducted himself and so on. Poor Thomas, you can't tell if he's asleep or awake. He never talks. I think he's talked 4 or 5 times in his entire time. I've heard him talk twice myself, so it may be that he's talked more than 4 or 5, but he excuses it. He says, I'm here to learn, not to talk. So.
Well, Ginsburg, of course, had a big role with the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, and she had been on a women's project for them before she was named by Clinton to the Supreme Court. So she was someone that had, quote, female credentials, a rather unusual amount of female credentials before she was named. Now there's a good deal of sort of rumor going around. She's getting pretty ancient, almost as ancient as us.
Oh yeah, I think she's 83.
She's 83, but she's always seemed sort of like someone that the wind would blow over.
Oh, well.
And it never did.
One night she was attending at a performance at the Kennedy Center, and she just went to the door to get a cab, which, dozens of people are doing when the performance is over. It looks like Cab City, USA, and somebody knocked her in the head and robbed her.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And she's so little and so looks weak, you know. And, she was knocked right to the ground that time, and but anyway, she always recovers. But her her current ill is pancreatic cancer, and I don't know any. I haven't seen a recent report within the last month or so, but just that it was discovered.
Recently. Well, you know, Drew, we've been talking on and on about the Supreme Court and highlighting some of the women in particular. The 4 women justices over the years, Sandra Day O'Connor, and then Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and more recently, of course, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan. And those 4 are the 4 justices who have been Supreme Court Associate Justices in the past years since 1981 when O'Connor was first named. So this is Lois Whaley, and thanking Drew Evarts very much for talking with us about the Supreme Court and highlighting in particular the 4 women who have served on the court. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.